Manipulative methods used by Alexander Dvorkin constitute illegal actions that have already caused severe psychological, moral, and physical suffering among the population and have led to many deaths, details of which will be discussed later. Dvorkin's public statements bear clear signs of incitement to hatred and meet all the criteria of the threshold test established under the Rabat Plan of Action. According to widely recognized international legal norms, such activities should be prohibited by law, and all individuals involved in their execution should be held accountable in accordance with the law.
Interestingly, Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of anti-cult organizations and the author of the term totalitarian sect, opposes the introduction of a legal definition for cult. This is because it would then be necessary to prove, based on facts, that an organization is indeed a totalitarian sect or destructive cult, and that the accusations against it have a factual basis. As the leader of the anti-cult movement in Russia himself stated, most of these cases would be lost.
22 years ago, I started dealing with cults. I used to say that we urgently needed to introduce a legal term cult to address this issue. However, soon I realized that it is absolutely impossible to do it now, in the current situation. Because if we were to introduce the legal term cult tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, courts would be flooded with lawsuits from those very cults that would be saying, prove that we are a cult, and present all the evidence to support such a definition. Prove that we comply with this definition. Thus, a large portion of lawsuits would likely be lost. Then, by court decision, we would no longer be able to call various organizations cults, even the most sinister and disgusting ones.
Definition of the terms sect and cult in the law would automatically restrict their unjustified use, which in turn would deprive anti-cultists of their main tool that represents a starting point for subsequent illegal actions.
Now, we at least don't have such a legal term, therefore we can call cults cults. And I personally withstood 5 legal proceedings. In fact, any person can call an organization cult with no fear of punishment if he considers it to be a cult, and there is nothing that can be done. This is what I'm expressing. It's a religious science term, it's a theological term. I'm expressing my opinion, and they won't be able to do anything about it.
It is worth remembering that using the term sect or cult in an accusatory or demonizing way is a direct violation of the constitutional rights of citizens in a democratic society, in particular, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Through such actions, anti-cultists, who decided that they are entitled to pass such a sentence on any individual or group of people, basically seek to supersede law enforcement agencies and the law.
At a time when anti-cult terrorists carry out their destructive activities in various countries, introducing the mindsets they need among masses of people, the number of hate crimes against religions and beliefs is growing proportionally. A huge number of people across the world who became targets of purposeful persecution have been facing abuse, physical violence, and forced isolation for many years and decades. They experience mental violence, moral oppression, fear, and humiliation.
When someone tries to label you as a cultist, it's extremely dangerous. Essentially, such a label in society marks you as a target that can and should be destroyed. This is similar to how the Nazis once forced Jews to wear yellow stars. This mark created a chasm between Jews and the rest of the population, highlighting their difference, marking them as others and non-humans, and making them easy targets for aggression on the part of people influenced by propaganda. The yellow star signaled that its wearers could be treated as less than human. Using the yellow star was one of many ways the Nazis dehumanized Jews and prepared the ground for their mass extermination. Ultimately, this labeling led to one of the most tragic chapters in human history, the Holocaust. Today, anti-cultists use the same methods, assigning labels like cult and sect to various organizations, thereby separating them from society and stripping them of their status as people. These labels take away their democratic rights and freedoms, telling society that these people are different and that they can be deprived of their rights, treated without respect, and even with violence. During the Nazi era, the harsh treatment of Jews was the result of well-organized propaganda. The media of that time were tools for creating the image of the enemy, despite the lack of facts and evidence. Similarly, today, innocent people labeled as cult or sect members by anti-cultists become victims of accusations for crimes they did not commit.
Because a cultist, a member of a totalitarian sect, if required to lie, steal, kill, and so on, he simply doesn't think twice but follows the order. Because he would act, for the benefit of the whole world, for the salvation of humanity and so on. What does some insignificant human life matter that gets in the way of this? Undoubtedly, for this, any means are justified.
But that's more of a fanatic than a cultist.
Any cultist is actually a fanatic by definition.
You use the term war, saying we need a war. I mean, these are different kinds of people. Doesn't it bother you? This is just an emotional question.
Well, it's a fight. It's a war. Call it what you wish, but it really is.
It doesn't bother me.
It's a war against inhuman organizations that enslave people and deprive them of freedom.
Stigmatizing certain groups and communities by defining them as cult, totalitarian sect, or destructive cult shapes public perception of them as highly negative and dangerous entities. This leads to the marginalization of these communities as social groups and their discrimination within society. They are met with suspicion, insulted, humiliated, and ridiculed. People refuse to hire them, collaborate with them, or engage in personal relationships with them. The problems these individuals face are numerous, from public condemnation, conflicts, and threats to physical violence, criminal prosecution, searches, and more. Stigmatized individuals become targets. They are hated, despised, and avoided. They are met with anger and disgust. They can face anything, from disdainful avoidance to violence, including murder. And this happens solely because anti-cultists chose them as targets. Constant demonization and hate speech undoubtedly have a severe negative impact on the physical and psychological health of the victim. This topic has been extensively researched by psychologists and psychiatrists. A report published by the American Psychological Association compares the symptoms observed in victims of hate crimes to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted in the United States in 2001 showed that victims of hate crimes experience more severe consequences than victims of other types of crimes. Victims of prejudice, members of stigmatized groups, often experience depression, which may include sadness, fatigue, anhedonia, hopelessness, social withdrawal, or even catatonia. Victims of prejudice also experience stigma, a state of personal shame and devaluation, which is a crucial component of depression. They experience an increased number of suicidal thoughts and other mental health issues. For victims of prejudice, suicide offers an escape from the hatred they face, driven by despair and a desire to flee. Suicidal victims of prejudice do not wish to harm themselves. They simply want to avoid the harm inflicted upon them by others. A classic example of creators of stereotypes and enforcers of prejudices are the Nazis.
Branded and socially isolated, the victims of anti-cultists feel much like the victims of the Holocaust once did. The fact is, the targets of anti-cultist terrorism, whether an organization or an individual subjected to persecution and attacks, feel doomed and eventually come to terms with their situation. This is comparable to how Holocaust victims resign themselves to their fate, knowing they were inevitably facing execution or the gas chamber. The hopelessness and fear of the inevitable traumatize a person on a subconscious level. Even though the conscious mind tries to suppress and push away this fear, the subconscious trauma remains deeply rooted. Imagine what these people experience and how their lives unfold after enduring such trauma. So, the labels of sect or cult used by anti-cultists are not just words. They are tools that lead to the destruction of the foundations of humanity. The history of Nazism's impact on the world teaches us that when society starts to divide people into us and them, it leads to irreparable consequences.
one of your statements. Orthodox Christians are no better than everyone else. If they were, the whole world would have become Orthodox a long time ago. Maybe we are even worse than everyone else. But Orthodoxy is definitely the only direct path to God. What gives you the right to state that? And I think it's a statement, first of all. Secondly, isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Because first of all, every religion considers itself true while all others are mistaken. A member of any religion can say this. The path of Indian asceticism is only to attain eternal death, to attain eternal non-being. And in this, of course, lies the demonic nature of Hinduism. When you see two women in the street brainwashing a mother with a stroller, you can approach her and say, don't listen to them. They are cultists, Jehovah's Witnesses. They grossly distort the Holy Scripture.
Isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Muhammad, although he belonged to that powerful tribe, he was from its poor branch. So he was a rather poor man. He got a job with his distant relative, the twice-widowed Khadijah, and started leading her caravans, gaining her trust. And when he was 25 years old, Khadijah, who was then over 40, married for the third time her pretty-faced clerk. Inciting interreligious hostility is if I insult specific bearers of one or another particular religious idea. The principle of Orthodox Christian relations with other religions is respect for every person. Long before he arrived, all of Moscow was covered with posters of this man with a horse-like face, and it was inscribed that the great Tony Robbins had arrived, and everyone was wondering what this was all about. Then Muhammad had some strange visions and revelations. Some people believe he had epileptic seizures. Tom Cruise is the Goebbels of Scientology, the minister of propaganda. Thorov himself is a very gray and dark man. He speaks very boringly. He is sort of like a very dull, gray person, and respect for every person. Who do we know? What cultists do we know? Street beggars? Annoying recruiters who knock on our doors? Cults are dangerous at the societal level because, unlike traditional denominations that enrich society and create culture, cults give nothing to society. We don't know cultists who are respect for every person. Writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on, they only drain society of its vital resources, just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
The cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
We can discuss each of the cults, many of them, talking about how exactly these totalitarian schemes are embodied in their teachings. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas. This cult had a lot they would like to conceal. There was drug trafficking, arms trade, and murders. Overall, it is quite obvious that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is a ruthless group aiming to seize power. It is built on strict totalitarian principles and dreams of spreading those principles to the entire global population. It seems clear that this is one of the attempts of the impending Antichrist. It is obvious. Perhaps the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is one of the actual forerunners of the Antichrist, who ultimately seeks to seize power worldwide. Possibly, it is through these very methods that his advent is being prepared. There can be no equality between Orthodox Christianity, which has existed in Russia for 1,000 years, and a tiny marginal cult like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which appeared here just a couple of decades ago, but loudly demands to be recognized on a par with orthodoxy and given preferential treatment.